What do you think the negatives of the Montessori method could be?
Here's what I believe the negative of Montessori is.
Welcome to the Future of Education podcast, hosted by MacKenzie Price. MacKenzie is the founder of a revolutionary new school model that's disrupting education through AI. Join us as we discuss the latest in education innovation.
So it turns out most of you, my dear listeners, are very interested in alternative schooling. Surprise, surprise. So today we're going to take an episode to dive into each of the different alternative schools that we know about. Jay, my producer, and I are going to go through a bunch of the different ones that we're familiar with. Homeschooling, micro schools, Waldorf schools, Montessori schools, 2-hour learning, all the different kinds of schools that are out there. And we're going to talk about kind of the pros and cons as we see them. I did a recent survey of you listeners, and it indicated that 66% of you believe that the education system is broken. Well, you guys know I absolutely believe that. So I think it is important to provide you guys with just options for what else is out there. Hey, Jay, thanks for hopping on to this side of the mic.
Absolutely. So this is what your listeners want to hear. This is what we're going to give them. What do you mean by alternative school?
Well, so I think that's a great place to start, Jay, is let's think about when we talk about alternatives, what are we comparing it to? We're comparing it to the traditional education system, which is one most of us grew up with. It's the brick and mortar in-person school. Often they're public schools. However, there are many private schools that are also doing this traditional system. It's teacher in front of a classroom. It's generally going to be, 15 to 30 plus students going through classes. So that's the traditional one. That's the type of model that I believe is broken. I do not think a teacher in front of a classroom model works. We'll go into details on that for those who don't know. So then we have to think about alternative education. And alternative education has really exploded in the last 2 years. Part of the reason is because COVID gave parents a chance to kind of see under the hood of what was happening at their schools. And they realized okay, I got to do something else. So I think the first thing we think about is alternative education is just saying, I'm doing something different than putting my kid on the local school bus that takes them to our local public school.
So alternative education is anything other than the teacher in front of the classroom lecture model kind of thing.
I think I would absolutely say that's a good way to start with it is alt ed, and it's a very popular, growing segment of the population is alternative education.
Is a groundswell movement. Like your Instagram and your socials is proof that this is a hot button issue. Everybody wants to know this. People are seeing their schools are broken. Something's wrong with our schools, and we're not blaming teachers. We're not blaming principals. People want to blame parents. Everybody has an opinion on what's wrong. That's not this podcast. I think what we're saying is parents and people in the United States specifically think something is wrong with schools. That's not even worth arguing anymore. The question is, what are the alternative schools that are out there? And let's dive into each one of them.
So we'll start with this idea that families who have decided they're leaving the traditional system, often what they're jumping into is micro schools. So micro schools are generally schools that are considered to be very small, usually less than 20 students. It's meant to be like a learning pod, a small learning pod. Often these schools are being run by individuals who are either operating them in their homes, or maybe they're going to a rec center or a church environment, something like that. But generally, this is the idea of a slightly mixed age classroom. A lot of times micro schools, here's the thing about a micro school is the person running it really gets to create whatever it is that they want. And there's a lot of professional groups. For example, there's a program called Primer that is basically trains people with curriculum to say, hey, go open your own micro school. And then people can recruit their friends or whatever that they're doing to put this in. So micro schools offer a lot of flexibility. In terms of the families that are choosing to go to these schools can decide, hey, here's how we focus. Here's what we're studying. Here's what our priorities are. It's just this general idea of a smaller environment that has a lot more flexibility.
Are micro schools accredited? These schools you're talking about?
All depends. Some are, some aren't. There's just a lot of flexibility within that. It depends on if a person who's running it is wanting to go through that. I will say the accreditation process is very, very lengthy. It's very thorough. It took us, I think it took us 2.5 years from start to finish to get accredited. And that was actually on a very fast track. So I would bet that a lot of these micro schools are not accredited. So micro schools are really just small schools. They're often multi-age schools. They typically have fewer than 150 students. You can often have micro schools with as few as 5 or 10 students. There's really quite a bit of range, but it's generally a small school. They're usually trying to combine the best of maybe traditional school with personalized learning. And there are micro schools in at least 36 states. They are generally averaging about 14 students per class. Some are actually even as small as 3 or 4 students. And it's estimated that there are about 1.5 million kids that are being educated in this way.
In a micro
school. Micro school. Yep. They're outside the traditional classroom. A lot of times these micro schools are being operated out of homes or churches or libraries or community centers. That's kind of what they're doing.
So why would somebody choose a micro school?
So first of all, micro schools offer a lot more flexibility around what they're focusing on. And somebody who's decided they want to start a micro school, they may say, hey, I want to start a micro school that's focused on, really diving into liberal arts, or I want to do a whole thing around civic leadership or community outreach, something like that. But in general, some of the pros of micro schools, first of all, they're much smaller class sizes. There's usually more individualized attention. And this is kind of an interesting one because a lot of parents think, wow, the more social experience is a bigger school. But I think a lot of people find that their kids who are going to micro schools have a richer socialization experience because often they're mixed age groups. Mm-hmm. And so they're getting interaction with a lot more kind of ages. They're having more interaction probably with adults. They're often done on the cheaper end. I shouldn't say cheaper, but they're more affordable than a lot of private schools are.
They're private schools, micro schools? Are generally private?
They're private schools, but I think given the fact that they're operating out of someone's house or maybe out of a local community center,
you can do that. I can just decide, hey, I'm going to start a school. I don't have to go and ask the government to do that.
It all depends on the state and what the requirements are. But yeah, there are a lot of people who are basically saying, hey, I'm sending my kid to a micro school. I know that for me, when I decided to take my kids out of the public education system. And basically, I started a micro school. It started in a house with 16 kids. I didn't have anyone in Texas asking me what I was doing with my kids. I was doing that. My understanding from way back then was just like, if it was reported that your kids weren't going to school, you were doing nothing for education. But yeah, they have a lot of flexibility.
That was 10 years ago, by the way.
Yeah, 10 years ago. We started with 16 kids. We've got we're educating over 1,000 right now.
That's
among
crazy.
Various methods.
So then the micro schools, I guess, we talked about the positives. What would be the negatives? I mean, I think what a lot of people are going to say is, well, that sounds weird. That's the first thing that I would think people. It's like my kid in a school with 20 other kids and they're all mixed ages. That sounds weird.
Yeah, well, I think in general, a lot of people think about any kind of alternative education as it's weird because it is different from what the majority of kids do and certainly from what the majority of us grew up experiencing.
Right.
But I will say I don't think they're necessarily raising weird kids, right? Now, I think as far as cons go, a lot of times these micro schools might have more limited resources. You're certainly not getting the football team and the
band, the drama,
the band practice. However, that doesn't mean that these micro schools aren't teaching music and doing sports activities. They have just a lot more flexibility.
I think they're a lot more popular for sure with younger kids, right? I think with elementary school kids, I can see tons of parents gravitating towards that because you're getting that individualized attention. And then middle school and high school, maybe doing something else.
I think some of the cons that maybe people look at with micro schools become larger as kids grow up, right? A smaller social experience does tend to be not as exciting for a high schooler as it is when you've got an 8-year-old who's like, I got 10 other kids to play with or whatever. But again, these micro schools also can be, a couple hundred kids. They don't have to be tiny. But I think in general, what we're finding with micro schools is people who say, I'm not satisfied with something and let me get together with some other like-minded individuals and let's go create our education system. So it really does allow for, hey, here's what our priorities are when we think about educating our kids, and let's do it in a group atmosphere. We'll talk more about homeschooling, but it's almost like a bunch of homeschoolers get together and say, hey, let's start a micro school and let's put a person or two or whatever who's kind of in charge of doing that.
A lot of people say, hey, let's do this. We don't like our school. You don't like your school. Let's hire a teacher together. And then we parents will be the quote school board and we'll have 20 kids in our little neighborhoods here and it'll be great. We will dictate everything and we know it'll be awesome. And it is.
And for me, when I was looking at what to do with my kids, because I knew I didn't want them in the system they were in, I looked around and I was like, well, I know I don't want to homeschool them because I'm not equipped. That's not an interest of mine is being the homeschool teacher, but I wanted them around others. And so that was where I was like, hey, a micro school is great. The other thing I want people to understand is that a micro school is a pretty achievable thing to make happen right now. Of course, you have to make it great, and I think there's probably a lot of micro schools that are not doing a good job, just like a lot of traditional schools that are not doing a good job. But for anyone out there who's going, oh my gosh, I'm not happy with the experience that my kids are having in their school, but what do I do? A micro school is actually something that can happen. For me, when I started out on this, it was very much just where can I find a great place for my children? I didn't go out saying, okay, I'm going to build an education empire that's going to change the world, which is my goal now. Like I want to change the world. I just was like, what can I do for my 2 children right now?
Would you consider the 2-hour learning model, which is a bunch of different schools right now? Are they micro schools?
We're micro schools. Exactly.
Okay. Oh, wow.
Yeah, we are micro schools. We're smaller schools. And that's like, our biggest school, the main Alpha that's in Austin, has a little over 200 kids in it. And in general, a lot of micro schools also believe that like 250 is about the highest. It's the highest number that they want. Okay. I think a lot of micro schools would say small, but they would say, I don't want to go above 250 students.
So what I'm hearing you say is that a parent listening can very much, it is within their power to do a micro school, start their own micro school in their area.
And actually, one of the things that, we're doing with 2-hour learning is we're allowing people to say, hey, I want to start a micro school and I want to use 2-hour learning as the academic platform for my school. Because I think a lot of people say, gosh, I know the life skills I would want to teach my children in a micro school, but how do I do the academics? And so that's one of the things that we're doing is opening these micro schools where either people can say, I want to start my own school. I'm going to use 2-hour learning as that, basically license it. And then we're also opening Alpha micro schools all over the country. So one of the things that we've been doing is just gathering interest from people in different cities who are like, hey, I want to bring an Alpha micro school to my city. For us, we'll do that with as few as 10 students.
Okay. What are the popular like brand name chains or whatever that you would consider are micro schools? Like, just tell us, like, what are those?
Yeah. Well, let me tell you one example of a micro school that has really been successful in so many ways. They've got hundreds of campuses around the world, Acton Academy. Okay. And Acton Academy was started here in Austin, Texas. Wow. Yes, the couple that started it, Jeff and Laura Sandifer, they're people that I know. They're phenomenal, incredible people. And they had this vision that, hey, we need to be encouraging students to, be more entrepreneurial, do more project-based learning, be more self-driven on things. And actually, the very beginning when we started, we were starting out as an Acton Academy.
Another type of school that the 2-hour learning model gets compared to a lot would be the Montessori method. What would you call that? Describe that to us.
Yeah. So Montessori is something that's actually pretty well known. It was developed by a woman named Dr. Maria Montessori. She was an Italian physician. It was started back in Rome in 1907, and it's a very child-centered approach with a lot of hands-on learning and very self-directed activities. And I will tell you that people who do Montessori love Montessori. I'm sure those who are in Montessori, they are all in like major fans of Montessori. Now, in a lot of Montessori schools you go to, often they're starting in preschool. They can be starting actually, as babies. Yeah, in infancy. But the idea is that kids are incredibly self-directed. They are very much considered to be responsible for their actions. And in a lot of Montessori schools, you go in and they're very quiet. The kids are literally working on self-guided activities, a lot of tactile things in the early years when these kids are 2, 3, 4 years old. They might be siphoning sand, and they're building with blocks, and they're doing a lot of kind of just self-directed hands-on learning. And Dr. Montessori really believed that traditional way of educating really prevented natural development and creativity and kind of stunted kids' potential. So I think in that way we have a lot in common in terms of doing that. So very kind of active. And I think a lot of people, especially for preschool, really love Montessori.
Okay. So it sounds like an artsy, to me, just as a layperson, I'm like, that sounds like the art school where they just do finger painting. No, I'm not knocking on Montessori.
I think they do a lot of that. And there's actually, I think there's over 3,000 Montessori schools in the U.S. And did you know that like 570 of them are public schools? So Montessori has been kind of incorporated on this as well. And so, there's a lot of great things, but independence and self-motivation. The teachers are also considered kind of like guides. And they do mixed age classrooms too. And so there's doing a lot of peer learning and real hands-on material. A lot of problem solving, critical thinking are some of the pros.
What do you think the negatives of the Montessori method could be?
Here's what I believe the negative of Montessori is. I think a lot of times kids who are doing Montessori aren't necessarily getting a lot of great traditional academic knowledge. And I will say we have a lot of students that come from a Montessori background and they're behind academically.
They come to 2-hour learning schools.
Yes.
Okay.
And I will say that I think that a lot of times with Montessori schools, they can go up to like age 8, 9, 10 years old. And I find that sometimes kids who come from Montessori, they are behind in some of their basic stuff around math, reading, that type of stuff. Now, to be clear, I know I'm going to make some people upset with this because remember, Montessori people love their Montessori. But we do kind of say it's not as rigorous academically. Yeah.
Well, they would say, because I've seen them, they're in the comments a lot. You got a lot of Montessori fans in your comments, and they are in the comments, and they would say that they're not behind. It's just a different path and they will catch up eventually. And they say that putting all this boxes and rules hurts kids long-term. That's what they would say, right?
I think they would say that. I know they definitely have, way less emphasis on kind of traditional benchmarks. They're certainly not fans of standardized testing. And I think they think, over time this will come. I do believe personally, this is my personal thing. I think Montessori can be great at young ages. And then I think kids need to get into a more academically rigorous environment.
Yeah, I've heard you use that word rigor. What does that mean to you?
So I think one of the things that's happened in this alt ed world is that people are like, hey, the traditional way doesn't work. Let's do alternative education. And often they say, okay, no standardized testing and let's do project-based workshops. That's where everything happens. Let's do project-based. So if we're learning math, let's learn math by going to the grocery store and adding up our food. There are lots of great cool things, but you know what else? Kids need to know math, right? They really need to know math. And so I love the idea that a child can take math knowledge and apply it to a business that they're creating or going to the grocery store, football stats or whatever else. I do think you need to know good basic math. I think you need to understand algebra. You need to do that. Now, you can argue how much calculus does someone need to know? And that's up to this. But certainly K through 8, there's just academic knowledge. And the reason I believe this, Jay, is because what we really want to do is raise great critical thinkers. And in order to be a great critical thinker, you have to have things within your brain to draw those critical thinking skills from. You have to have knowledge in there. You can't be a good critical thinker if your head's not full of that knowledge. And so I think that's one of the things. But let me just get in on a quick side note because of this, standardized testing. A lot of alternative education does not like standardized testing. And in the traditional world, standardized testing is pretty brutal because it's like teachers are teaching to the test,
Right.
kids take the test, and then afterwards, nothing happens
And the
except
funding is
maybe
tied to the
funding
test.
is tied to this, or a school gets a grade. But nothing actually happens for that student as a
Right.
result of how they do on that test. The reason that my philosophy is very different is because we're able to use AI technology to really do almost like a CAT scan of a kid's brain. We can take standardized tests and we can understand, okay, this is what a child knows, this is what they don't know, and let's feed in what they don't know. Let's help them learn that. Let's make sure they're having mastery. In a traditional classroom, that's not possible to do because you can't provide a completely individually tailored education curriculum to each and every kid based on where they are. We can do that with AI, and so
I know that
that's
they
one
get,
of the things I
like,
would say.
with standardized testing. I remember with my kids, I would get their results and I would actually kind of read through and see, oh, they need help in this or that, or they're really good in this or that. But the school never did anything. They just give them the test and then all they care really about, the schools, and I'm not blaming them, but all the schools really care about is overall, our students are doing good.
Yes.
They don't care about the individual student as much. They care about the whole because they just want their funding and they just want their school to look good and they want the things. But you're right. They don't have any follow-up and go, oh, your kid needs help on this. We're going to change our curriculum now. They never do that.
Well, and think about you as a parent, that's fantastic that you would go into that next level. And, we use MAP tests for our standardized testing. That's one of the measures we use. And one of the things I always like to ask people when I'm in front of an audience, I'll say, hey, does your school do MAP testing? And there's always at least a few parents who raise their hand and say, yes, my school does MAP tests. And I say, do they share the report with you? Yes, they do. And I say, how long is the report? They'll say, oh, it's 1 page or it's 2 pages. I'm like, actually, MAP reports are several pages long because they do give literally information at each level and subject about this student doesn't know this concept or whatever. But usually schools don't give that information to the parents because they're like, there's nothing we're going to do about it. So if you're a parent and your school does standardized testing,
ask for the
go
test.
and ask for the full report. Don't just ask for what they give you. Say, I need to know the full report. And you can go online and find out how long is a MAP test. They're like 18, 20 pages long, right? How long are the results of this test report? And a lot of times, schools are just giving the summary first page.
Thanks for listening to MacKenzie Price and the Future of Education podcast. If you haven't hit that subscribe button, now is the time to do it so you can stay up to date on all our episodes. You can connect with MacKenzie on social media and be part of our daily conversation over on Instagram at futureof_education. For more info about the show and our guests, you can always visit futureofeducationpod.com. Lastly, if you're loving what you're learning, please leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts. That wraps up part 1 of this episode, but don't worry, there's a part 2 coming soon.